intros versus outros versus this versus that, and like everybody ends up with their style, and I'm kind of like in this point right now where like we're gonna do it live. Let's just do it live.
Yes. Just like the Fox News host without the profanity, right?
What an epic meltdown that was. It's so easy to fall down this rabbit hole in terms of like equipment, and the AirPods are actually really good quality. If you use the AirPods, they're really good quality. The thing that like makes everybody crazy is you have to go into your Bluetooth settings and make it so the AirPod doesn't automatically switch between devices. So if you remember to do that, then you don't have to worry about like your phone taking your AirPod off your computer and then doing something else with it. And like, which is why like everybody's like, oh, just get like an actual corded headset and like plug it into the computer, because then you've got this thing and you notice it. I mean, if you get like really into it, I don't do the production, but I've listened to enough of them now where it's like you can hear the difference between a regular mic, this mic, that mic, and the differential is so minimal.
Yeah, but in some cases, it's people going from, a Pinto that's 30 years old, right, which is a $17, microphone that they bought at Walmart, right, and just upgrading to something like a headset like this, right, makes a significant difference in quality, right? So you look at the first couple that we recorded and you listen to the audio on a few people on there, and it's just like, you know. And like you said, you can spend a lot of money in getting gear for podcasts.
So I had a Blue Yeti. The thing I liked about the Blue Yeti was I could pace in my office on speakerphone, and like the Yeti would get it. But then when you were using it for recording, it would get everything else as well. So it wasn't great. So I went from a Blue Yeti to the Shure, which was great. But then all of a sudden, you need an audio interface, phantom power, a discrete headset, and you turn around and you're like, did I really need all this stuff? But like, you're so far into like, you're just like digging, like shoveling dirt over your shoulder. You're like,
do you have the little mixer board yet? Like that's got the presets that you sit in front of you?
I bought one. I used it for a little bit and I was like, I don't need this. And I got rid of it, with like the reaction sounds.
Yeah. It makes you look like a real professional podcaster. Come on.
No, I don't need like the noise. No, I don't. I literally I bought one and I got rid of it. What I did was, so I'm in like this light experience right now, trying to figure out lighting, and that's another deep hole that once you start digging, like it is so deep. And Elgato, I think is a company. They have their lights, the key lights, which are pretty good. So that's why I bought that thing for the desk, so I could turn the lights on and off. But then they're like 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi. So then they like lose sync and they come back, you can't turn them on, and like there was like I was having all this drama with those lights, and so I ended up buying like something just to have on tripods, like set up for lights. Dude, I'm telling you, just record, like just just like,
don't let perfection get in the way of progress, right? Just get out there and start recording and learn stuff along the way. Yeah.
So you just got back from Black Hat, right? You're out at Black Hat?
No, this year I didn't go. We have a significant amount of work this year, and so we sent Jake Williams, our VP of R&D, out there, and he represented Hunter this year.
I haven't been to a Black Hat in forever. I can remember, I was thinking about this last night. I think the first Black Hat that I went to was probably like 25, 26 years ago. And it was like such the perfect encapsulation of like what Black Hat actually is. In like some crazy, stupid off-strip hotel that's like, happy you're there because they're going to go under if they don't get the revenue, but at the same time they're like at war with all of everybody like showing up for the conference, and all these nerds running around with their ham radios. And like, what was incredible about that, I had two things that came out of that one for me. The first one was I sat in a talk, and it was like seating room only, with Bruce Schneider. His presentation was elliptical curve cryptography and quantum computing for break. I mean, it was like,
I understood some of those words.
I absorbed like all of like that much of what he was talking about, but it was like you had this, and this was like 99, in 98, 99, and you could have this like glimpse of the future of like where things were going and how far forward this guy was thinking, because we're just starting to see quantum computing now. That was impressive. Second thing that happened was before another talk, they were doing like lightning rounds, and a guy gets up and just starts reading out people's passwords because everybody's like,
I think that was the old wall of Pondone or wall of shame or something like that. I can't remember what it was, but yeah.
That was like the same thing for me. It was like, walking into that place, I knew not to carry a cell phone, not to have a laptop, not to have anything beaconing. It was just like, you just know you're going to get yourself in trouble.
Look, I mean, there's always that element to it, but I would say, in my experience, the vast majority of hackers that are there to not cause a bad scene, right, and not cause a problem. This year there was quite a bit of drama, right, with what Hilton did and how they handled, room communications. And so, thankfully that I'm aware of, there's no major incidents out of DEF CON or Black Hat. So, it's definitely a community, and it's definitely a place where, one bad apple can ruin the whole bunch, right? All it takes is one moron to do something stupid to give a bad name to a conference, and unfortunately those people are there, right? And so
The thing that was always amazing about it to me was just a level of curiosity of people, really like more than anything else. It was just the like, I want to know how this works and I'm going to figure out how this works. And you can't like, nobody's going to tell me how this works. So I'm just going to figure out how it works. And, and that like, kind of like, like the real hacker ethos, you know?
Yeah, and I think that's the appeal of the summer camp, to be honest with you, right? And that's what it's called, is Hacker Summer Camp for a lot of people, right? Because DEF CON and Black Hat overlap each other, and it's basically 2 weeks, right? 10 days, right? And as an adult, right, if you can line your PTO up, right, and your work up appropriately, it's 10 days where exactly what you said, where you get to be a kid again. Right. And you get to go look at all the things that you don't know about, right? Or you don't have time to investigate, right, in the hacking world. And you can be like, oh, I'm going to go over here and mess with Hardware Hacking Village, right, for 3 days because that's what I want to do, and I can't do it, and I don't have the stuff in my everyday job, right? So it really is, this font of renewal for a lot of hackers every year, where they go and get all of their curiosity that maybe they can't get in their everyday life, fulfilled. So I think it's a great thing. I think that it's challenging in Vegas, and you look at other conferences like Wild West Hackin' Fest, that's in Deadwood, that is just moving to Denver next year, right? And the moving to other cities, right, that are easily accessible and are maybe a little bit more friendly on the infosec side. So those are some things that I would, Blue Team Con, Wild West Hackin' Fest, those kinds of cons are really where you get to know, I think, more of the community, and you get a lot more closeness, right? Rather than some of the larger cons that are out there. So they have their purposes, right? Don't get me wrong. I learn a lot, do a lot of cool stuff, and there's scale of things that you can do. Black Hat, you can't do at smaller cons, and it's an experience. I remember my first DEF CON. I took, was it first or second? I think it was second DEF CON. And it'll be interesting to see if this person actually ever sees this part of if we ever edit this in, right? But first DEF CON, I took an employee with me who had 3 children and was not supposed to have a fourth, and his fourth child was conceived in Vegas the very first time I ever took him to DEF CON, because he took his wife with him, and so now I tell him, "You're welcome. I am responsible for your fourth child." Right?
That's a great story though.
Yeah.
AJ, I put together like a little docket when we first set this up. But now, when we set this up to schedule it to now, like a lot's happened. So I think before we go into like any of my list here, I kind of throw it to you of like anything you think we should talk about, because there's been a little news in the security world in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, good point. And I'm thankful that you're editing this, Max, is the short of it, and we can restate that if you want, because I got to think a minute, because I didn't have notes ready to go.
So you've got some, of course, amazing stories on Twitter about, physical pen testing with different facilities. They're always fun. And knowing people that have done this and been in this space is always, of course, wild to see. And, myself, like going through secure facilities, I think, the realities of what people tell you and the differences between what people tell you versus what's actually going on. Like with that, we could talk about that. That's interesting. That kind of leads into like this idea around checking the box security, right? We see this a lot right now. Usually it's compliance driven, external org, supply chain. Hey, you have to go do X, Y, and Z. I have mixed feelings about that. I'd be interested in your thoughts.
One of the other things that I would look at too, and there's actually a really, really good talk as well that Jake Williams, our VP of R&D, did at RSA. And it talks about security for the have-nots, right? And it's really about security in the SMB world, right? And how, in some cases, how high the bar is, right? For just look, you mentioned it earlier on, right? When it talks about, hey, if I want to get into podcasting and I wanted to use Riverside, one user, right, is $900 a month, right? And when you start talking about, low services in the security world, and you're like, hey, I am a 2 or 3 person, right, CPA office, right, that has access to a bunch of sensitive financial, or legal office, right, that has access to a bunch of sensitive financial or personal information, they don't have the overhead, right, to run a proper security program,
Let's talk about this. Let's get into this a little bit. I'm going to prompt you with a couple of things with this one. Okay, so in our world, when we're talking with our clients and talking with enterprises and people that are like in some phase of a security journey, I notice a huge line for most service providers at around 100 seats. There's the 100 and under, 100 and over becomes like the first really big line. Now, there's other lines, right? But a lot of tooling really kind of has this idea that you're coming to the table with 100 seats. So if you're less than 100 seats, it gets really difficult because your cost per seat increases a lot. Now, there's another issue with that with the SMB. There's vendors in the market that have SMB bundles and they try to put a bunch of tooling together, and maybe it's an EDR plus asset and vulnerability and patching and like all these things that kind of swirl together. I've had a lot of conversations with SMBs after they've had issues. Like something has happened to them. And then that's usually a triggering event for most people. Like we've had something happen and like it didn't put us out of business, but like we had a bad experience. There's a bad taste in our mouth. Let's not do this. Now what do we do? And we start talking about it. Like here's kind of like the levels, like do this, do this, do this, and kind of work your way down or work your way up, however you want to how to visualize it. And then you get into like you run into the wall. And like I had a conversation of a few weeks ago, and this the CEO, the owner of the company, says to me, "Man, that sounds like a drag." Now in that case, the drag was
Welcome to my life in security.
let's talk about this, right? So in that case, what we were talking about that was a drag was enabling MFA on his Google Workspace account, right? I wasn't, we weren't like really getting into the weeds of like, let's do some really crazy stuff. It was like, let's just turn on multi-factor.
Right. You're not talking DLP or data labeling or.
And here's my last thing of prompting here. The question I'm asking you is because I've been asking this question for the better part of a decade right now, which is how do you sell security to people that are not buying security? Because there's like this idea and this expectation of like, everybody needs it, everybody wants it, but how do you actually sell it and not be like just in this order transactional process of like, hey, we're out shopping for an EDR, we're out shopping for a SEG, or we're out shopping for a blank tool and like check that box and go sell it. And I thought that for a long time that it was insurance that would push this issue, which kind of seems like it maybe is or maybe isn't. And now I think it might be something else, but I want to hear your side of this first. And we can talk about the SMBs and we can talk about enterprise.
Yeah, and like you said, there's lots of fingers, right, that we can go and spin off on here from a discussions perspective, right, in the space. And I liked your comment around how do you sell people, security that aren't buying security? Because you're right, it's very much, as you said that, all I could think about was car insurance, right? And there are definitely an element of people that even though it's mandated and required that you drive on the street with car insurance, they don't have car insurance, right? There's a reason why there's underinsured and uninsured, right? And, the thing I would say is, I do think that insurance is slowly driving changes in the space, right? So there's a conference that happens twice a year, one on the West Coast, one on the East Coast. It's called Net Diligence. And it is a conference effectively for the cybersecurity risk space, right? So it's for underwriters, it's for privacy lawyers, right? For DFIR type of events. And they get together and they talk about, cybersecurity insurance. And so this was a good 2 to 3 years ago now, right? I was at the one in Santa Monica, and conversations there that were from actual providers, right? People that issue the insurance policies, are that things such as, well, you're not going to be issued an insurance policy unless you have 24/7 monitoring, right? So unless you have an MDR service of some kind, right? That's coming, right? In the future. Now, to your point, so what? I don't buy cyber insurance anyway, thanks, right? And, I think the reality there comes down in to your point from a business perspective is how do you create the desire, right, to purchase or the need to purchase. And this is one of my favorite stories, and I do calls for IANS, so the Institute of Applied Network Security, on a weekly basis. And one of the things that I talk about in there is, as security practitioners, we oftentimes take accountability or ownership of risk, right? Because we feel obligated to do it. We know how to take care of it. We feel bad about the risk, right? And we change the pain point for the person who is responsible for the risk ultimately, right? And so the story goes, you walk up to a farmer and he's sitting on a porch with his dog, and this kid walks up to the farmer, and every so often the dog like raises his head up in the aisle and howls in pain. The kid's like, "What's wrong with your dog, man?" He's like, "Oh, he's laying on a nail." And he's like, "Well, why doesn't he move?" And he goes, "He will when it hurts bad enough," right? And unfortunately, in a lot of cases, that's the reality, right? Now, in this case, hurts bad enough, right, can mean your business shuts down, right? Because, it can be a life ending or a business ending event. I shouldn't say life ending, but, in certain cases.
Well, it could be life-ending depending on industry.
Sure, fair enough. Yeah, if you're in industry and you're working, in that space, it could be, So at least the approach today is I don't know the answer to that question, right? Of how do you sell security to someone who's not buying? I think that the only thing that you can do is continue to make it painful. And I think the bigger challenge comes into the general population, right? As a whole, doesn't both understand, right, and know how to ask, right? And there's such a lack of understanding of everywhere our data goes, right? Anymore, just this most recent breach, right? They said every single social security number of every American. And I'm sitting there just like, yeah, whatever. My social security was gone a long time ago. All this, this security monitoring insurance is a joke, right? It's just,
If anybody ever pays for credit monitoring at this point, like you're just, you like, why? Like you're going to have free credit monitoring for the rest of your life,
all you got to do is go do some paperwork and fill it out. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because you guaranteed your information's compromised somewhere, and you have free credit monitoring. And by the time that one expires, another one's going to come up, right?
Yeah, agree. So, people crap on Microsoft, and others because they're like, oh, bundled security and all these things. And it's like, are those products that Microsoft has best of breed? No, they're not. In almost all cases, they're not. Now, I'm not saying they're not good, right? You talk Defender, you talk, Sentinel, and those are all things that, Defender loses to CrowdStrike, right? In some instances, right? But it makes it accessible, right? To the small business owner. It makes it to where they don't have to necessarily think or understand, right? And I think that where some of the disconnect lies is everybody, and this is one of the things I like about Office, right? Is or Microsoft Office is sometimes it forces the purchase, right, of those other tools that are out there. And I personally believe that the likes of Microsoft and Google should be turning things on by default, right? In other words, you don't get the option anymore to have an email account that doesn't have MFA. Sorry, that's just how things work, right? I don't care if you don't like it, right? It's like a password. I'm sorry that you don't like to, you want your password to be 1 2 3 4 5 6. We've shut that ability off, right? So to me, we talked quite a bit there, but there's a lot of different elements. I don't think either one of us will know the why. Ultimately, it comes down to they don't understand it. It's too expensive, right, for them and their operating model. And when they start, heck, man, how many people in the U.S. Operate at a 7th grade reading level? I think, or 8th grade reading level. I think they said 70 or 80%.
Okay, so let's defend. Let's start with E5 security.
Sure. Since I know you're a huge fan.
I'm a huge fan. I started my career as a MCSE. Like I went through the MCSE program, NT 4.0. I did 3 of the tests. I went out and I got a job as a network engineer, field engineer for a VAR, going out and doing field supports, right? So I'm not an MCSE because I never took like whatever, but I did
right.
NT4, TCP/IP, and Exchange 5.0 are like my certs, if I remember correctly. So I don't think I got the file and print cert. Like, I'm sorry. Like to your point, right? Like defaults matter and are so critical. And when my base argument against the purchasing cycle of E5 security is not, on the lower end of the market of like, okay, now we're being forced into it, or it's there, or it's accessible to us, and let's get it. Because 100%, right? Like adding Sentinel and Defender on top of, your stack, like it takes you from like here to like, so like you get into like nuances, like, okay, CrowdStrike versus Sentinel versus this versus that versus the next thing, and like we can talk about like the technical differences of these things, but like the overall improvement of your posture is already so high. But the problem that I see with these things deployed all the time is this false perception of like, okay, I have it now, I'm secure, I'm okay. Or we installed it and my fill in the blank IT team that's not trained on this product can actually implement this properly. Or the third one I see, which is, oh, we've hired some service provider in our neighborhood that has 6 engineers that are now and we're now like our security team and we're secure. And I'm like, and you get in these conversations, you're like, okay, well, so you have a managed detection and response, like, an MDR service in play. And you say, okay, well, how big's the SOC? Well, there's no SOC. Okay, what's the network engineering bench look like? Oh, there's six. Well, I don't know. Okay, let's ask. How many engineers do you have? Well, we have 6. How are you managing cybersecurity for your customers? You're not. You're just like installing the tool and checking the box, and then saying, and then there's this this perception, and I worry about that from the eventuality of like, oh, we were supposed to be secure, because that's what we were told, but then we weren't, and like it doesn't work, and so let's rip this whole thing out. Like I got people talking about ripping CrowdStrike out now, and you're like, pump the brakes. Like that's not a response we want. So that's where I get really fired up about this. Now I get the whole other thing, which is the buying a security tool from the OEM that's writing the operating system, that's trying to patch the operating system, that's not just included with the operating system. It would be, I'm at the point where like, should this just be a feature of 365 as opposed to a paid add-on? Like this is comes with it. Like that would be, I think, would be now Sentinel with the storage. I do like Sentinel also, and I think Sentinel is really good for the MDR vendors who now can decouple the SIM from their sales cycle, where you don't have to explain how much your data retention is going to be, and that's like on the enterprise. So
Well, the thing I would say, but that's like, so look, in Hunter operates in this space, right? Like we operate almost exclusively in cloud-based SIM, right? And managed SOC. And what I would tell you is Sentinel is extremely hard to understand in price, right? Like you have to give such a wide berth of range to your customer because 99.99% of people, right, don't know what their data flow is, right? They have no clue, right? And so even if you run through the Microsoft calculator, right, and input all of the things correctly, right, you're talking in most, let's just take a roughly 2,000 person, headcount organization, right? You're talking 15 to 20 grand a month, right, of just ingest, right, on the Sentinel side of things, right? And then to your point, right, it comes in the play of, well, we have security, and someone that had local admin got a phishing, right, email, and they clicked on a thing, and oh my god, what good is our security? You guys don't ever stop anything, right? And so yes, you are right, in the small business world, right, you can have all the things, but then there's just there's the belief, right, that, well, I bought the thing and the thing is going to protect me from everything, right? And if I have it, why aren't I paying for it? And then the third thing I would say that's been really good in the S&B space is the release of Lighthouse for Defender, right? Which is the ability, right, for an SMB provider, right, to go into these smaller shops that don't have Sentinel, right, that don't have CrowdStrike or others, and maybe all they have, is Defender for Endpoint in their environment on top of their Office 365 subscription, and you can now ingest a shop of 60 users, right, into your Microsoft MSSP Lighthouse tenant, and as a provider, it does not cost you any dollars, right, to set that up, right? And so I like that model and the ability to support smaller, customers with that model. But you're right. I like to call it such a Russian nesting doll problem, right? Where it's just like, oh, let's go fix this problem. Oh, no, this, right? And you have to get that business owner to understand, right, a lot of things at that very small layer and how they support and stack foundationally across security. And it's a challenge, right? It's hard.
where I've gotten to this is like my core of these, I think, come down to, let's call it like three evils, right? The first evil is that since the start of time, like IT and business don't know how to talk to each other. And so that we end up with terms that get pushed from business to IT, that IT then learns how to talk, right? So ROI and TCO. And being in a security engagement, and then it's like people want to talk about ROI and TCO on a security suite. And you're like, we can quantify it in terms of like risk reduction for an insurance policy, because that has a direct correlation. But what is the ROI on deploying, this tooling that's not, and everybody's like, oh, it's like an insurance policy. And you're like, security is not an insurance policy. Insurance policies pay you after the building burns down. Like what you're trying to do here is keep the building from burning down. So like, what's the ROI on a sprinkler system, right? Like,
Yeah, and the thing I'll just interrupt real quick on that, which is just what's hard is in order to actually calculate that kind of stuff in enterprise, they go to your BCPDR team and they say, hey, go give me your BIAs, right? I want to have an understanding of all your business processes and all the breakdowns in there, right? Because if this one business process goes down, right, because of a security event, it costs us $27,000 an hour for this to be down, right? And so to your point, it's not a ROI, right? It's just a removal of potential spend in the future because you did a thing, right? And even then, to your point, it's not a guaranteed, right? removal of the thing.
And in your and what you did, and now let's go back, right? Because that process you're talking about in that documentation, SMB versus enterprise, doesn't exist. I mean, like sub a couple thousand seats. Yeah, well, okay,
It doesn't exist in enterprise.
we're not talking about that right now. I can't like one. So that's my first evil. Second evil, the security industry I think perpetuated, which is the security maturation model for enterprise. And then you end up with these like vendor presentations that show like, ladder steppings of like where are you on the security maturation, and like are you here, are you here, and then your quadrants are all these different things, and you're talking to a non-technical buyer, and they're like, okay, well, what's the difference between like a level 4 and a level 6 and a level 8, and you're like, I don't know, I can't tell you, like it's better, but like what's the difference between it, like I don't know.
I mean, and theoretically speaking, it's 1,000 differences, right? Because you could be a level 8, right, and be level 4 over here, or you could be a level 8 over here and a level 4 over here, and they both equal out to be level 5, right? So like it's just, to your point, it's impossible to explain.
And then my third one, and this is really kind of what I think is, so like I'm happy that supply chain's pushing it. I'm happy that we're seeing things like CMMC that are pushing this. I'm happy that like, we have TPN and Media Entertainment pushing, security down the stack, right? These are all reactions, of course, to bad events happening and them saying, let's not have this bad event again. And so my third kind of hypothesis is just scar tissue, right? Which is, how long does it take for enough bad things to happen to enough people that there becomes this like collective response to like, oh no, my neighbor's business went under because they had an email thing that happened to them. And like, how do we not have the email thing ourselves? Because I saw this guy lose his house, and I want locks on my doors now because I've learned the lesson. Like you need to have locks. So I kind of wonder about it in that term a little bit of just how long it takes for like the collective pain. Because a lot of this stuff is underground. People will be like, oh, we've had this breach and all your social security numbers have been leaked. And everybody's like, okay, yeah, whatever, who cares, And then you see imagery, like from Colonial Pipeline with like people filling up pickup beds truck, with like tarps in them with gasoline. And you're like, you've got a plastic tarp in the bed of your pickup truck and you're pumping gasoline into it. Or what was the one in Boston, the hospital chain in Boston that had ransomware, and they enlisted the National Guard to come out and help them reimage the computers. And there's photos of fatigue wearing National Guard in the hospital, like going computer to computer just because they needed additional bodies to try to go and recover the hospital network, however many buildings were down. And you look at this and you're like, man, like it's terrifying for me because like, like you think you project forward a little bit.
Yeah. No, completely agree. And when you talk about business ending events, right? And unfortunately, that's really terrible to say actually, right? But unfortunately, we as a society, right, mute and have tools, right? I was just reading last night about a particular tool that's available, and I'm gonna forget the name of it now, but it's available. Effect. It's an acronym, of course, right? But it's a financial recourse tool where, for an example, the $15 million, right, that got paid for ransomware for Caesars early, like they got $13 million of that back, right? They seized 13 million, right? And in this other case, they got 42 million back, right? So even though the person committed the issue, right, and they went through some of these benefits or through some of these steps, right, to be compromised by the threat actor and send the money, after the fact we were able to pull that back and stop the pain, right? And it's just such, to your point, in the SMB space, there's so many things that unless there's an event, security will most likely not come to the top of someone's mind unless they work in a regulated industry, right? And they're forced to by regulation, right? But if you take and you push those together and you say, well, that's great, then the state of the medical world security should be awesome because we have HIPAA and we have PCI and we have, all these rules. And it's like, it's almost like counterintuitive. You have more legislation, right, around protecting things that are in the medical space, and yet the medical world is probably one of the worst security, verticals out there from an overall security perspective. And so it's expensive to keep people, it's expensive to hire providers, right? And as you said, most people don't think about that in relation to their product, right? They price their product, and if you are operating as a lawyer, a doctor, whatever it may be, in a certain area, and everybody's competing and no one else is including the cost of security in their business model, right? And now you do, right? And you start losing business because you've had to increase your prices, right? It's a self-perpetuating model. It's challenging.
I'm going to tell you two stories. They're similar, but they're two stories. I'm going to tell you two stories, and then I'm interested in get your feedback, right? So the first story, I'm at a conference, and I think my NDA still exists, right? And there's a CISO talking from a $1 billion plus revenue organization with lots of locations and lots of employees and lots of stuff. We'll just kind of leave it at that. And this person basically explains, where they are in the org chart, and that this person has a total budget for security of $11 million of tools and people. So north of $1 billion plus revenue business, not valuation, like dollars coming in, top line, over a billion. And the entire security apparatus for the business was $11 million for tools and people. And what this person was explaining was reflecting on what they were trying to accomplish with their job became very like they viewed their job really in their team of just trying to identify stuff as quickly as possible and figure out how to take it off the network and then have other people go deal with it, pushing it back to the traditional IT team. Hey, this device is doing something weird, go figure it out, right? Like it became this very, like what can you hope to achieve is basically the thing. A couple of years later, I'm having a conversation with another person who's running security for a unicorn company. So this is not revenue, this is valuation after funding. Lots of users, same thing, lots of stuff. And was asked to write the plan. Like, how do we protect, what do we need to do here? And wrote the plan. And basically came back and was told, like, okay, you're not getting this. You asked for this, you're going to get this, figure it out kind of thing. And this person, I was talking to them later, and they basically told me that they had a very nice salary to be the person that was fired when something happened. Like they checked the box.
No, it's serious. Like let's jam on that one for just a little bit, right? Because I had a almost exact same conversation with Jake earlier this week, and it was just and we were talking about the position of security executives, right? And the fact that a lot of these firms will hire a CISO, right? And to your point, the only job of that CISO, right, is to juggle balls, answer pretty questionnaires, and then be the fall guy when something happens, so they can be like, we've sacked our CISO, right? And we were, and to your point, like that's their job, right? And they know it, and they know that they are only there for that purpose, right? And then you mentioned earlier, you talked about this facility that's like that their only job is to, hey, there's a problem, right? And I think one of my favorite commercials ever that I talk about in security all the time, and I can't remember, I think it's like a State Farm commercial. I'm gonna have to go find it, but it's the scene opens up and people are standing in a bank, and it's a nice quiet afternoon. There's a security guard standing there, right? And all of a sudden, four masked men burst into the bank, and everybody on the ground, right? And the security guard gets down and laying next to the lady, and she's like, "You're a security guard, aren't you gonna do anything?" And he's like, "Oh, I'm not a security guard. I'm a security monitor." And he looks at her and goes, "There's a robbery." Right. And I just die, like, because it's such a great illustration in security, which is just like, hey, there's something wrong over here. I'm done now. Bye. Right. Like, and that's really what it feels like, right? In a lot of cases, is we're not empowered, right, to do the job that you're being asked us to do, and or you're just given a figurehead, right?
Where's the breakdown come from? Where do you think? I mean, because fundamentally, I think people in the IT space and security space are trying to, like you were saying earlier, take on a lot of stuff, right? Like I have yet to meet somebody who doesn't really like try to take on a lot of stuff and is really trying to do something good for the organization they're working for, right? But there's a really big disconnect. What do you think? How do we fix that disconnect in the security space of the organization? And I mean, it's got to be, and I'm hoping that there's something that's more than my idea of like scar tissue, right? Like, what is the miss right now for people in security team, space, like going and talking to the CFO or talking to the GC of a company and really moving the ball forward?
I worked in the financial services world, right? And when I joined it, right, the security team, and again, at the time, this organization was Fortune 114, multiple billions of dollars in revenue, right? When I joined, they had 7 people on their security team, right? They're in 50 countries globally, right? 4 of those people were GRC people that managed the ISO 27000 BCP process, right? So there wasn't an actual hands-on security function, right? I remember we had a BEC event, right? Because they didn't have MFA deployed, right? And got through that event. But I'll never forget one of the comments that, that came out of our chief legal counsel officer's mouth was, "We have an ISO 27001 certificate. Doesn't that mean anything?" And it's hard as a security person, right, to not do what you just did, right? Which is just like you're in the middle of this huge incident and somebody says something to you that you're just like, you just want to face palm and slide your hand down your face while they say it, right? And so when you talk about shifting, number one, it is educating, right? And getting people to understand what security means. I think that security people as a whole really suck at selling the idea, the need, the concept, the drivers behind security. So that's number one. I talked about it earlier about moving the nail, right, from a pain point perspective. And when I talk about things like third party vendor risk management, right, and third party management in organizations, these TPVRM teams, right, they don't have good risk acceptance policies in place. They don't have good risk acceptance processes in place, and they're not reporting on those things, right? And so in the enterprise, when you're talking about those things, it's okay, Mr. Product owner, or Mr. COO, or Mrs. CFO, whatever it may be, that runs the organization. This software, this infrastructure, this whatever would not exist if it wasn't for your particular line of business, your particular needs. You are the owner of this, right? IT does not own this, right? We are the dealership that you bring your car to for servicing, right? Maybe a little bit more than that, right? But we don't own it. And unfortunately, a lot of IT and security people take a lot of ownership in the system, right? Now, I'm not saying that from a mental space is bad, right? But from a decisioning space, and you think about a RACI chart, right? Responsible, accountable, consented, informed. It's you may be the R that does the hands-on keyboard type stuff, but you're not accountable for the overall health of that program, right? And so, from a business perspective, what I encourage people to do is number one, build a risk acceptance program where when someone that owns an asset tells you that they don't want to do something in a security world, you go, great, I'm going to write up the risk right here. I'm going to give you a section that says, hey, here's the reason why we need this. We're going to make $27 billion, right, on this one line of business. So I'm going to accept this risk. And you say, great, awesome, fill out the paperwork, sign here, please, right? And let's be clear, there's lots of nuance to sign here, right? Because a company officer has to be the one that does it, right? So don't let anybody do it, right? We can get into risk management programs all day long, but then take that, aggregate it, right? Go to your quarterly board meetings with an aggregation, right, of all of your accepted risk, and you're constantly rebubbling that up, talking about it, right? Forcing recertification of that risk, right? And until that happens, right? Like I don't, again, the people who are responsible for signing the checks are not feeling the pain, right? And we take that away from them regularly because I'm not forcing someone who owns insurance, right? Like directors of boards carry E&O insurance, officers of companies carry E&O insurance, right? For these reasons, right? For different kinds of reasons, so that when they accept risk, right? If they have a problem, they can fall back on that, right? Officers of companies are legally liable, right? Especially publicly traded companies, right? For the decisions that they make can be held to account by their stakeholders. So if you as a security person are like, well, yep, these guys said they can't do MFA because that's a legacy application that sits on the mainframe, so we're just going to have to put that on the risk register and away we go. And that risk register is never reviewed. That executive never has to, right, put any pain towards it. You start thinking about things like ramping security costs, right? Risky cars have more costs, right, to insure than a Toyota Camry, right? And so I think there's lots of levers, but it to change that paradigm, but it takes a lot of work, and it takes a leadership team in both the security and business space that are tied in and care and want to do those things, right? Like you can try to establish a risk acceptance program, and if your executive team, your audit committee, whatever it be, doesn't support you, good luck, right? So that's at least my initial viewpoint of how you start steering away from ownership in IT and security.
I've written more BCDR plans than I ever want to like verbalize. And early in my career, developing the BCR plans, it was always like the 10-point earthquake's going to hit and we have to do X, Y, and Z and yada, yada, yada. And like there was all these things, right? Being in SoCal. And after a few years of doing this and the frustration of like, like how many, like, days, weeks, months of my life, into this like massive document, and then having nothing happen with it, finally occurred to me. And I think this was part of the maturation cycle of me as an IT practitioner, was the board had a fiduciary duty to evaluate the risk versus cost mitigation, but not necessarily to actually mitigate or address the risk, right? So we had, and this is a really simplistic example of this, right? Like, oh, potential risk of an earthquake hitting, and this is what happens to our facilities if it does, and this is what it costs to protect against this, risk. And the perceived, occurrence of this particular event is so low that, like, what do we do with it, right? And in those cases, it was like, oh, okay, great. Thank you for the plan. We've had the plan. We've evaluated it. We've done our fiduciary duty to the company. We've decided it's not worth spending the money to implement a mitigation to this risk, right? And, and I've heard a lot of chatter and talk about, this like shifting of, personal liability, for people making these decisions in the board, and like, what does it actually mean? And what I'm always kind of fascinated with that conversation becomes, if the company can't afford to do something, like, have you done the fiduciary duty to the company as your role on the board of directors or as an executive to say, hey, look, we evaluated this and we decided not to do it, because we just couldn't do it, So like now you get into the E&O policy, right? Does the E&O policy start mandating certain things because now they're going to, but okay, we have cyber insurance policies that dictate that you have to do penetration testing. I know a company that has to do their annual penetration testing, and it runs and they fail and they get the report, and then they find in their logs the IP address of the pen test system. They block that pen test IP. They run the pen test again. They pass. They move on with their life, right?
Somebody give me a pen so I can stab in my eye. Like, come on. Yes, and as an offensive security provider, right, you run into those people from time to time as well, right? That's just like, can't you just run the scan and give us the thing? And it's like, sorry, that's not a pen test, you know?
But what they get and what their requirement is, that's just it. That, somebody on the other side is like going through their process and saying, oh, if we pen tested all of our vendors, and it's like, the vendor, have they passed the pen test? And it's like, oh, we have a successful pen test that's come out. Now, I don't think that anybody involved in this actually thinks they have security. They're just like trying to move on with their life and, in the easiest way possible.
One of the things that just popped into my mind when you said that was automobile safety, right? And automobile manufacturing. And if you think of some of the correlations there, right? There are a standardized set of tests that every single automobile goes through, right? Example being NTSB has a requirement for crush, right? Where and it's literally every car is put into a machine and they apply a hydraulic crusher to it. And they're like, do you meet the requirements of, 3X the whatever it may be, right? Before the car fails. And so you start talking about things like what are regulation and things along those lines. It's like, to your point, because human beings are so red teamy and hacky in nature, they're just like, how can I do the minimum to get around this? Right? You have to be like, the legislation will have to get very, very granular and verbose. And I think we're going to have to introduce some forms of standards, right? That define, this is what a pen test is. And the funny part is too, I don't know if you've run into CREST, right? Like the CREST certification, right? And the cancer that is CREST. But I think that that's what they were trying to do effectively, is you're a CREST certified provider, which says you operate, pen testing off of these standards. But the person's just going to go find somebody that doesn't care, right? And give them the report anyway, So,
and of course, like, this whole thing becomes so acronym heavy. It's like, oh, you know, are we doing DAST, versus SAST, right? And like, what are we actually trying to achieve with this? And what I've really I'm trying to force, like, for myself, this thing of like, are we communicating in a way that like the business understands? Like, is there a business why that we're actually driving towards? Otherwise, like, what are we doing, here? Like, what's the business why? Because then people understand what you're trying to explain to them. And that's actually an interesting segue. I tell everybody, when they're starting out and they're asking like, okay, we want to do, we've something's happened, whatever's going on, we want to improve our security because we've either hit some requirement wall, or we just know we need to do it, or we had some issue, or whatever it is. And I start with identity, Like, do you actually have some sort of identity provider that makes sense that you have control over, right? Usually for most people, that's they're on 365 or Google Workspace or they're on Okta, right? It's like, have you selected an identity provider? And then my next question is like, where are you on the MFA journey? I mean, SMS based two-factor authentication, I think, is like such heart garbage. And the fact that I have banks that like won't give me another alternative, it's like, well, we're not going to do business with you anymore as a bank. Like, this is nuts.
Yeah, I bank at Wells Fargo, and it's one of those things where like you either have SMS or they give you an RSA hard coded token, and it's like, what?
But so like in the in the multi-factor world, you have SMS. Google's actually, like, and Microsoft and Google, I think, are really trying to push the ball forward here on this one. And Google doing MFA inside of other apps, like open the YouTube app. Like, there's a cynic in me, which is like, okay, now you have to have the YouTube app installed on your phone, which they know is going to lead to like view time, right? Minutes of consumption. But like at the same time, you're like, okay, that actually is a better security posture for most people. Like, okay, like I can accept the like approach. And then you get into like the keys, right? Like UB keys are not expensive, but the level of effort for a company to go from SMS to, TOTP to, WebAuthn to YubiKey, right? Like, these are like hurdling mountains, it feels like with a lot of people.
Especially, look, and here's the thing. Good, to your point, you find out where they sit on an identity journey, right? And identity is a big passion of mine as well. And when you start talking about things like birthright roles, right, and joiner mover leaver programs, right, and all of the different elements of that, when they don't have any of those in place, you're just like, okay, when was the last time you did a user entitlement review? A user what, right? And you know I think you bring up a great point, which is it's not just a technological hurdle, right? It's 3 to 5 years to implement a strong, solid, good identity program as a whole, right? If you're starting from scratch, right? And people don't understand that, right? They don't understand the investment that it takes. And look, to your point, you're buying products that are not secure by default, right? And so you're literally adding to your technical debt, right? As you're going along the path, right, of 3 to 5 years, because you still have to operate business and all those things, right? And
Let me interrupt you. CBO does 10-year projections on legislation because that way you can't have politicians pushing legislation. But then at the same time, the counter to that becomes projects that are too long, politicians won't push because it has no political value for them if it's a 10-year project and they're going to be running for re-election in 2 years and yada, yada, yada. And when you say like a strong identity project has 3 to 5 years of you've got a 2-year turnover average for an enterprise, of like stat. I mean, you have people that are shorter and longer, but when you look at it all the way up and down the stack, including executive teams at this point, like, there's roughly like a 2-year like churn rate. How the heck do you approach a project that's a 3 to 5 year like life cycle if you're talking about churning your org that's running that all the way up to your executive sponsor, like twice at least inside of that duration of time?
yeah, and I think we could spend another 3 hours talking about like the spinoffs of why people are turning over, right? In lots of places, right? But it's like I think you have to break it down into smaller consumable chunks, right? And I think that you have to start creating incentive. Look, people do what they are incentivized to do at the end of the day, right? And so it's like if you are hiring a CISO, you're hiring an executive team, right? You're building a security team. It's like build your incentives around where you want them to go and what you want them to do, right? But now we're getting back to the root of the problem, which is if you're hiring a CISO, how, and as a security issue, right, you don't know what to tell them, right? Like, yeah, it's a chicken and egg problem.
Well, and these things are so important. Colonial Pipeline, credentials from a person who was long gone, VPN access into the network, and then you run hog wild, right? So you're talking about like what was the actual financial exposure to that company because you had a VPN concentrator authenticating with credentials for somebody that wasn't with the business for at least a year. And you unpack that for a second, and you're like, on the surface, you're like, this isn't a huge technical challenge, but then the reality of orgs at these sizes, it becomes huge technical challenges because of the amount of like everything that's going on inside of this org and how difficult it is to actually implement these things.
Yeah, and I don't think we have a good answer for that, right? Which in reality, it just comes down to you're going to have to break your identity program into smaller chunks. You're going to have to start educating, at the highest levels, right? And I think that's a lot of what some of these bigger consulting firms are trying to do, right? Is start educating at the highest levels, but then you've got you've got the McKinseys, you've got the, of the world that are going into a boardroom and educating, sorry, educating, right? And it's a 28-year-old master's student, right, that has never actually seen something, right? And they're reading off of a list of recommendations, right? I don't know if you saw it, the McKinsey study on New York and the trash cans, and it's like they paid, I don't remember, several $1 million, right, for them to come back and be like, "Hey guys, you need trash cans." You know, it's like, what are we doing?
Stop putting trash on the street, put them in trash cans. Okay, I think this is interesting. I'm gonna take this a slightly different direction. There's lots of vendors in the space in the market. We've got tool vendors, we've got professional services organizations, we have SOCs, we have all these different things. Now there's a lot of roll up, there's a lot of action and activity going on in the PE space, rolling up MDR platforms and coming up. So what does that create? That creates sales teams. Sales teams have quotas. They go out and they cold call and they do all these different things. A few years ago, there was a really viral moment on LinkedIn over a company in the Bay, and it started with a security practitioner who was cold called on her cell phone, and then posted this rant that she received a cold call on her cell phone from this like horrible security company, which then was piled on with her SecOps team or CISO from this company, going on about how offensive it is. They've gotten a phone call from a security company, like trying to like talk to them about their product and like, don't call us, we'll call you. And by the way, we won't call you because if we need something, we're going to ask our friends what they're running. And that's how we're going to make decisions in the security world.
Yeah, and I think what you're pointing out here really is it just comes down. There's a lot of look in all areas of business. There's a lot of good old boys, right? And there's a lot of handshaking. There's a lot of tunnel vision, right? And unfortunately, the good old boy that you choose to be your plumber to blow out, to pump out your septic tank, and you're like, hey, my buddy pumps out septic tanks, probably doesn't matter as much, right? And if you take the same approach in the security world, the impact is significantly different, right? I saw something on Twitter the other day that was like, every time that you think that you are failing, it's like, remember that there's someone out there that is confidently wrong, right? Advising other people, right, in the same aspect. And unfortunately, security is a new enough domain and there's enough black magic around it, right? There's enough voodoo around it. There's enough, it's opaque enough that it's still somewhat easy, right, for a person to come in and masquerade that they know what they're doing, right? And, it ends up being the blind leading the blind, right? And you get a bad security leader in. Look, let's be honest, you get a bad leader in any spot and it impacts, but security tends to be, I would say more of those. And so how do you fight those? Well, look, in this particular instance, now I'm gonna have to go look this up, right? But it's funny too. I even caught myself like, LinkedIn is going crazy ways. Like, I'm like, wow, you said that on LinkedIn? Like, I saw some of that stuff this morning. I'm just like, man, you people are bold. You're posting on your work, associated, like, and it's just like, geez, right? So that's a whole other conversation by itself, right? But at the end of the day, what I've come down to, right, and how I have, built my organization and our team is its relationship and education, right? If you are out there in security trying to, throw mud against the wall and see if it sticks and trying to build it fast, right? Sure, there are lots of unicorns, but if you're talking about in the services world, right, it's about relationship and it's about delivery, right? And it's about showing people how they can start winning with some smaller efforts and some small changes, and how they can drastically change their posture with just a few small things, right? So can you fight against the good old boys? No. And it's like screaming into the void in most cases. It's just going to get you frustrated, right? And is it really going to do anything? So if you run into someone like that, right, at that point, it's just like, I keep moving forward. I ignore that person and I move on. But to what you speak of, it's a problem in the larger industry as a whole. And how do we solve that? I'm quite certain that a lot of people on LinkedIn saw that and knew it was wrong, right? And knew that the team saying it was wrong. And I'm not saying that LinkedIn's the place to do this, right? Because it's not, right? And you shouldn't be calling out those people, but we have to police our own, right?
I, for some reason, didn't get involved in this debate. I just sat on it for a couple of days. And there were a couple things about it. It was like, first off, yelling at the SDR or AE that called you and putting them on blast. It's like your cell phone number's in Zoom info. Like, get over it. Like, And who put it in Zim? The vendor you're currently using, like that's who put it in Zoom info, right? They updated the database. But after a few days of like kind of thinking about that one specifically, what kind of dawned on me was they don't have any budget to even think about evaluating these tools, probably. So it's like it's this weird thing where you've got now a company and a sales org actually calling out and trying to prospect and develop business, and you're calling into organizations that by definition like don't have budget. Like like there's a reason why they're not shopping for your tool, because they can't get it. And I wonder, it wasn't stated this way, but I wonder how much of that was just a frustration response of like getting called like every day with some new tool and being in a position where you have no budget to go acquire a tool in the first place.
Yeah, and look, speaking as a guy that gets calls on his cell phone from security vendors, right? Now, while I would never take that to LinkedIn and put somebody on blast on LinkedIn unless somebody was just like racist or misogynistic or something like that with me on a call, right? I would never put them on blast, but one, let's be honest here, right? Some of those calls that come in, right, are not necessarily professional level calls, right? And you're getting, some of it's the sales approach. Again, I go back to cyber, right, and just saying like it is we as a cybersecurity vertical stink at understanding what customer needs are. So it's a little bit of a hard problem to have. To your point, it's absolutely uncalled for behavior. How do we solve it? We've been talking about it for the last hour, right? There's so many elements to it, right? That it's pretty challenging. I think it just starts with one day at a time, 1% at a time, right? And slowly chewing things down. I don't know that the security industry, right, as a whole, I think that the collective, the you, the me's of the world, right, that are in the trenches, right, going out doing the fighting, those are the people that make the difference, that go and have the conversations with the small business owners, that spend the time to educate them, right? And that's why I like relationship, right? That's why I like the approach that I have, right? Or that we take, right? And I think you do too, right? I've seen the conversations that you've had in some of your podcasts and the way that you talk about things, which is just like, look, I'm not here to get things over on you, right? I'm not here to get you to buy a thing. I'm here to help you be more secure and help your business, be more resilient. If that's what you want to do, great. If not, no problem, right? Now the unfortunate part is in the security world that and when you're selling services that so many no problems, and you no longer have a business, right?
There's different ways that we approach that here, which is some of it becomes like, I don't want to say subversive, right? But like there's a certain element where it's, you can find ways of squeezing better security posture into other things, like, hey, we're doing a network overhaul, we're doing an SD-WAN overhaul. It's like, you can like, and a lot of times maybe it's just positioning where it's like, I can, you have enough experience with this. It's like, I can look 16, 17, 18 months down the road with an organization and say, okay, let's solve this problem, but let's put something in place right now that makes it really easy for you to tackle the next thing when you like get to that point. And those are like my favorite phone calls, when I get a call back from a client that says, okay, we need to do X, Y, and Z. And it's like, okay, fantastic. You're already ready for it. Like all we have to do is just like do an addendum on this thing and turn it on. And they're like, wait, that's it? And it's like, yeah, that's it.
Yeah, let's jam on that for a minute, right? Because I think that a lot of security leaders, to your point, you talked earlier about not having a budget for something, right? And let's use the example that you just used, which is network segmentation, right? Is a huge foundational security control, right? Which I'm quite positive out of the total number of companies in the world, 99% of them don't have it, right? Just like don't have it in any way, or don't have it done properly, right?
Show me a firewall and I'll show you an allow everything outbound rule.
Well, I mean, look, let's go back to the SolarWinds hack, right? There was only one department in the entirety of the U.S. government that wasn't impacted. Why? They had outbound egress filtering implemented, right? And so, let's use it as an example though, and just say, as a security leader, right, and you join an organization and you like, wow, we don't have any network segmentation at all. I need to put that project on my project list, right? Okay, sure. Are you going and talking to your peers that run the network, right? Are you understanding what project cycles they are in, what their pain points are, what they're attempting to do? Because to your point, right, Who knows, maybe they're spinning up a new network segment for some other project, and you can be like, hey, while you're doing that, can we start spinning up a network segment that I can slowly start migrating things into over time that is going to help with the segmentation, right? I'll provide the architecture, I'll provide the resources, I'll do whatever, help you, right? But can we do this, right? And add it in, and you would be surprised, to your point, how often you're going to get across the aisle collaboration, right? But you have to invest the time as a security leader to, one, understand what your needs are, right? And two, go and build that relationship with your peer in the space to help accomplish things that you won't otherwise do. And some people may come out and say, well, that's not fair. Security is the only one that has to do that. I'm like, so, right? And they're not, just to be clear, but the answer that I come back with is, so what? Right?
Everybody sees the world from their own eyes and their own position, right? And you made a comment earlier about like, IT they don't own your application. They're there to help you with the application, but it's not like how many applications did IT actually pick in the history of them in the organization, right? Like the answer is
Maybe VMware,
maybe VMware, but they didn't pick what's running on top of VMware, right? Like VMware's there to help them make whatever else is there run easier, right? And segmentation. So this is a fun one. Okay, let's so segmentation and network upgrades, triggering events, right? We have a new office, we have a new build, we have a new geography, we're going expansion international. We need to have visibility into our network traffic between two different locations. We want to overlay marketing, some sort of marketing, something on top of this traffic as well. We need to have a segment for guest access, guest Wi-Fi. We want to track people in our retail locations, right? Like there's like all those examples, if you're not actually talking to the organization and trusted in helping people achieve their business goals, like you're not going to find out. But if you knew that the person who runs your retail organization for all of your retail locations across whatever geography is trying to do some marketing initiative where they can track customer traffic through your stores, and you can tack onto that and be like, hey, we can solve that problem. And for free, we can also get all this other stuff as well at the same time. Like those are phenomenal wins for the organization, right?
I love, yeah, and look, that's the thing, that when you talk about how do you get security initiatives forward, what you just said is the skeleton key, right? Which is, go find a business initiative that either won't go through, right? Or will be greatly enhanced, or you can hide is the wrong term, right? Because it's terrible. It's a terrible illustration, but you can pair up, right, to your point, and your security requirements with this business initiative, and for air quotes free or very little amount of dollars, right, you can change the security posture, right? Again, that's absolutely right, a path that you should take. And you talked earlier in the show about ROI, right? Which is just like, that is a great way to show ROI, right? And it's hard to do, right? But if you can go find that initiative, and if you can spend the time, again, you hear everyone always talk more like a business leader, learn the business, learn this, right? And I remember as a young security executive being like, what are they talking about, right? Like what am I supposed to be doing here, right? And understanding it, and really that's it, which is, go and find the business objectives, go and find the each departmental level, right? What's the COO of that department trying to accomplish, right? And to your point, again, within the last decade, financial services organization, we were doing a contract with Goldman Sachs, right? And that particular leader of that unit, that COO, right, needed me and my team to get that contract through, right? And what did I do, right? Is, to your point, you pair up, you deliver with them, right? You use that as a proof of concept. I implemented certain things with his business unit as a proof of concept to show that they worked, right? And then the very next cycle, you go back to your board and you say, look, I did all these things with this business unit and it only cost us X amount of dollars because they leaned in, right? And now the board's like, oh, cool, you can do it, right? And by the way, you are now creating a environment of competition where all the other people, right, don't want to look crappy compared to the new guy who just bumped all of his security level up, right? And they may not want to invest the effort to be first, but they damn sure don't want to be last, right? So if they're coming into those next risk meetings, they're going to be like, oh yeah, we went and talked to AJ about that thing on security, right? And we're working on all these other things too now, right? And so you can play with a little bit of some of the elements of human psychology there as well.
I find a lot of people go after this and they do it from like a share shift approach. It comes from like a human resourcing standpoint. I mean, a good example is like oh, we've got 500 firewalls deployed. Like, what's our, the big ones you go into, what's our CapEx cycle on those firewalls? What's our annual OpEx and support on those firewalls? But then you say, okay, what's our patching and firmware update process on those firewalls? You have 500 firewalls. How often do you touch them? How do you get people on site? And it's crazy because even in an organization running that, when you start asking those questions, not all the times they'll have hard answers for you. And they're like, well, we don't know. It's like, well, how long does it take you to deploy a firmware update across all 500 boxes in your fleet, right? Or like, oh, I don't know. Let's go talk about it. And then you say, well, what's your change management control process, right? Like, how do you get this approved?
Back to the Russian nesting doll problem, my friend.
Exactly. And then you could say, okay, great. Well, like, do you want to get out of this business? And do you want to invest in something else that like kind of takes you forward? You focus on offensive security. And I look at this, I think, a lot broader than you do, right? Because I have to be.
Well, let's just be clear too, just for clarification. So I have an offensive security team, right? But we have a blue team and a red team. So
Okay. You should define those, like what that actually means.
I'm sorry, like for the show?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, my bad. I missed that question. Great point. So blue team and red team, and look, the thing I would say, it's funny because I'm a bit pedantic, right, on our offensive security side, and our team is called Offensive Security Operations, right, or short OSO, because a lot of us are military, from a military background, right? But right, red teaming is also a subcategory of offensive security, right? So people can get oftentimes confused about the differences between red team and red teaming, right? And what they exist for. So from a layman's terms, blue is defense, red is offense, right? So if you think about this in the football world, your red team is supposed to be your scout team, right? That comes up against the varsity team and makes them better, right? They're the ones that are supposed to be going out and studying the plays, running the plays, right? And testing and preparing the blue team for the game, right? The game of security that happens every single day, right? So your red team is the ones that are coming out, is coming out and performing your penetration testing, your physical security, right? They're looking at application security, right? They're doing things like SAST, static code analysis, dynamic code analysis, all those things. And your blue team is effectively your defensive organization that is saying, we're doing the monitoring, we're doing the engineering, we're doing the configuration, right? They're doing all of the defensive apparatus, monitoring apparatus, right, within your environment. And I'm going to say this, loudly and proudly, the red team only exists to make the blue team better, right? Period. Dot. And if you think that your job as a red teamer is different, right, you're wrong, right? And I will die on that hill, right? So when it comes down in red versus blue, right, and how you go about interacting between those two and the things that you find and the work that you do, it's critically important to have a good relationship between the two and have a symbiotic relationship between red and blue, which is when you talk about how hard it is to move the dial, in my opinion, that's a little bit of the secret, right? Is using the red team. That's why for all of our customers, right, at a base level, we loop in 40 hours a year of offensive security, which is just like, you can use this on whatever you want, but we're going to make you use it. You're going to pay for it, right? You're already paying for it already, and you start using those things to get people to highlight and understand, right, security. I think that the average person would be scared if you went and did a physical security evaluation of their house, right? There's a lot of people that sit there and they have this false sense of security about their house, right? They're just like, oh yeah, I got a great deadbolt on my door, and it's like 90% of doors I can one kick through, right?
Yeah, you have a good deadbolt, but you've got a 3/4 inch screw into your door frame. If you didn't put in the 3 inch, yeah, I'm with you. I get.
Even then, right, or you've got a 1/2 inch of a 2x4 that's holding, the deadbolt, right, into the wall, and some plywood that's on top, or some sheetrock that's on top of it, right? So it just comes down to, there's a false sense of security, right, in a lot of places, and people don't know how to react. So I lost a little bit of the train of thought there because you asked me to define red and blue. So
Now, what I wanted to get to with this was, there becomes like I think an expectation and standards, and like people just conform to these expectations and standards. So at this point, for the most part, people understand that they should have identity, they should have MFA, they should have an EDR. I don't think a lot of people understand if they should have a SIM, what the SIM does for them, what threat intelligence does for them, like how they do the rest of this stuff, right? And a conversation I've started having a lot with, and it's like EDR versus SWG, SWG and RBI, right? And how do you fit, like, if you could budget for only one of them, here's a hypothetical. AJ, you could have an SWG with RBI, or you could have an EDR in your organization. So this becomes, I think, a lot of the fund, like I've noticed this challenge in a lot of places. It's like, how do you, it's like, okay, I get what an SWG does, a secure web gateway, right? I get an SWG does. I get what browser inspection does and being able to exploit a payload. I want to have microsegmentation, or I want to have zero trust network access. I want to have ZTNA deployed. I want CASB. I want DLP. Like, by the way, everything I just described kind of gets wrapped up into this like SASE kind of platform, and SSE platform. So you could turn a lot of these things with a lot of these providers now. You can like select which tools you're turning on, which is nice. So that's getting nice. But when you're talking about this with an organization, you say, okay, as I'm going through this journey now of trying to modernize an organization, and we've gone after and we've tackled identity to a reasonable level, and we've gone after and we've got MFA to a reasonable level. Like everybody has some form of MFA running. Like what's next and why?
There's lots of different approaches that you can come through there, right? And I think, unfortunately, in the non-SMB world, right, you're not going to have a choice. EDR is going to be mandated to you by an insurance policy, right? It's interesting. I was at RSA earlier this year, right, and was having conversations, with Mandiant, and was actually talking to one of the CTI leads at Mandiant. And you look at things like Google's enterprise browser, right? And Google and Mandiant as a whole, they've literally taken all of their applications. So Google now has this fully embedded Android operating system, right, inside of Chrome, and Mandiant has taken and converted all of their applications into browser-based applications that run on the Android OS inside of Chrome. And so a little bit of my conversation comes back to saying things like, well, it's a consultant answer if it depends, right, on where you're at in other spaces in your journey, right? Because I would come back to you and be like, hey, great, you have MFA deployed, but to our earlier conversation, what does your identity look like, right? Have you hardened, right, your Active Directory environment, right? Have you hardened your endpoint environment? Have you removed local administrator from your endpoints, right? To me, before I go and engage with anything that is going to require, I would say, additional spend or expertise or learn new platforms, I'm going to go back and look at the foundational controls that exist in your environment, right? Do you have asset management in place, right?
Probably not. Probably not.
Probably not, right? Which is just like, and people don't understand why is asset management number one, right? Like, it's been the CIS number one for as long as I can remember, right? I think since CIS has come out.
And it's the least invested. Nobody wants to buy it. It's not sexy.
It's not, but it's like, look, we have this challenge all the time where people are like, well, I want AI, right? I want automation in my SecOps. Cool. You're not getting that at all unless you have asset management in place, right? Like, period dot. You're not getting, you shouldn't have a automation in place, because how am I supposed to action on things that I don't know exist, what their context is, who owns them, how can I set up rules around those things, right? Any of those things. And so that's what I would be going back with, is to your point, what if you went and looked at what is the vast majority of causes of these larger hacks throughout the world, right? To your point, identity is one of them, right? Even the last the Storm issue with Microsoft, right? Oh, sorry, it was a development account we forgot about that didn't have MFA on it, right?
That stuff is so frustrating to me, because you're like, it's always such low hanging fruit, it seems. At the end of the day, it's like such low hanging fruit. And there's this perception of like hackers being this like really organized, targeted thing. And you're like, no, take a device, plug it on the internet, turn it on, and just wait. And it's going to get like, it's just blah, blah, blah,
Look, so let's use that for a second, because I don't think that the average person understands that, right? And I'll hearken an incident, a real life incident that happened, right? And I want to say in 2019, we were doing firewall work in an organization. We were troubleshooting a particular issue with email, and we were trying to understand, we were going through an Office 365 migration at the time, right? And we were trying to understand why there was an issue, right? And why email flow was being interrupted. And we had a very skilled, but also arrogant consultant, right, working on that particular effort. And there's probably 15 people, right, on a call, and we're working through, and he's like, well, I'm gonna go ahead and remove some of these ACLs, right, or access control list rules in the firewall. And we're like, He tells us which one he's going to remove, and we're like, okay, well, you can pause those temporarily or comment them out, right? And we're going through it, and things are working now, and literally we're scrolling, right? I'm not hands on keyboard at this point. I'm in a leadership role, and we're watching through, and I'm like, hold on, right? Like I just saw TCP/IP any in that config. What's going on, right? And this individual had done a TCP/IP any on the external interface and had left it open for 47 minutes, right? Understand in that 47 minutes, right, that there were 7 to 8 machines that were already in the process of, they had been hit from a scanner, they had been identified as vulnerable, right, and they had started having malware installed on them, right? So to your point, you go and look at some of these, the Twitter feeds of people that run honeypots professionally, right, as part of their business, and that's what they do, right? They literally take an unpatched machine and they plug it into the internet. That's it, right? And to your point, there are a legion of automations out there that are just looking for open vulnerabilities, right? To say, hey, let's go exploit it.
Dwell time used to be north of 200 days. Now we see dwell time. I mean, like, I don't know what stats scarier to me, actually. I don't know if a dwell time, of almost a year, or north of a year is scary versus a dwell time of like, 2 weeks. And, because like the idea of like somebody being on a network for a year before, they're found compromised, event happens, or that, dwell time has gotten so short because they've gotten so good at just going and said the heck with it. Where we're on the network, we've sold credentials, we've moved it on to somebody else, and they've launched, and they've done something. Like it's both equally terrifying, and in reading those stats, it was a joke I read recently, a meme, and it was like every network is beaconing something to Nigeria or China, like take your pick, right? And it's like asset management. I'm just thinking about asset management stories. The one that did it for me for the asset management, it made me, like really made me a believer in asset management. I'm not successful at getting everybody to use it, but like made me a believer, was Log4j. And I had one organization, and there were two things actually this organization went through. The first one was Log4j. And like the reality of like Log4j was literally running everywhere. Like they had no idea that they were running Log4j. Like Log4j is in everything on their network. And then every time they think they patch Log4j, then it became like, oh, nope, that was exploitable too. And that's still exploitable. And there was like this whack-a-mole going on, but at least they knew where it was. Like it was a crazy process for them and it was a nightmare for them, but they knew where it was. That same organization went through fun with the Circle CI, which is another one that I just will rant about to the end of the universe. God bless whoever was their customer that noticed, credentials being misused and actually notified them that, by the way, you've been compromised. We've traced it to you. They never disclosed it, so I don't know if I can say it.
Yeah, fair enough. So I do want to go back and answer your answer question because I've been kind of chewing on that. We said asset management, right? What's number one? But if I was going to say what's the first immediate thing that has the most impact from a risk perspective, I would absolutely go and do what you said, which is a user access review, right? Which is, sure, you've already applied MFA, but let's implement a process from a regular user access review. I would recommend people do it quarterly at a minimum, right? Where you're auditing your join, remove, or leader processes, right? And you're making sure that people are not over provisioned in their security space, that there's not an active account of someone who's been terminated, any of those things, right? And then number two for me would probably be, if you have any sort of directory in place, like go hard in that directory, right? Go spend the time, go invest. Like if you have an enterprise agreement with Microsoft, they have some great services that are out there that you can do, Active Directory. I can't remember what it's called, but it's as a service, right? And I think the first time that I used it with Microsoft, we got like a 92-page remediation report, right? Of, hey, go implement all these things. And just you're laughing, yeah. And just to be clear, it was 18 months, right, of every single weekend, right, making changes just to get rid of the criticals, right?
I'm laughing because this is like the whole thing of like, oh, we're on the cloud, we're secure, and it's like, no, you're not. And like, hey, we're a professional organization, and we have a 92-page remediation report from the vendor that everybody else is using with the same issues. That like, it's just like every company, you're like probably got a 92-page remediation process on your Active Directory at this point, like,
yeah. And saying that, I would say brought something up that I think is really important in the SMB space. And that is, if you're an SMB owner, right, that maybe understands technology in some way or plays in the technology marketplace, understand that there are a ton of open source community tools that are out there that you can use to harden your network, right? So let's just use directory services as an example, right? Ping Castle was recently in the news because they got acquired, right? You can go out today and download a community version of Ping Castle, even if you are not a technologist, right? Like, even if you're not a hands-on keyboard, you can figure out how to download and run that and point that, and you can get a report inside of an hour, right? That will cost you $0, and it will tell you 90% of the things, right? Just as an example, and this is a complete tangent, but it's like, how many of you have reset your KRB TGT token in the last 5 years?
How many people even know what that means?
Right? Agree, right? But that's my point. But like, Ping Castle will go out and run that report for you and be like, hey, you should do this thing. And oh, by the way, Microsoft actually recommends you do that every quarter, right? And there's lots of downstream impacts. But my point being, look, there's community versions of Bloodhound, there's community versions of Ping Castle, right? There's community versions of Raptor, right? There's all kinds of community versions out there that you can use if you don't have the budget. So keep that in mind.
And this is why, I mean, look, I came from IT consulting. I went in house. I owned a service provider, right? Like, I've been around the horn on this one a couple of times. And this is why it's become my like underlying, like, you should be engaging service providers for a lot of these things, because like, I'm sorry, your team is being crushed right now just trying to keep the lights on. And there's no way that you're like,
Other duties as assigned.
yeah, no, I mean, like, I love it. Like, oh, we downloaded and installed Snort. And it's like, how long did you run it before you turned off the email alerts? 25 minutes, or like whatever it was. And my favorite actual Trojan horse, you triggered this for me, HRIS systems. So if your company, like, here's a free tidbit of information, right? If your company you get to a certain size, or you're already at that size and you're going backwards, right? But Workday, Rippling, like, I don't care what it is that you're implementing, but if you're implementing an HRS system, that is like literally just the opportunity of a lifetime to go tackle an identity project inside the organization, because the deliverable to the business is, hey, HR team and business leaders, you can now onboard and offboard on your own without talking to us as an IT organization. No ticket creation, no follow-ups, no emails. You could do it all inside the HRS platform. And that's what our promise is to you. And in exchange, like, we just have to do X, Y, and Z, which is going to take us some time. And you know what happens?
Yeah, don't even mention security, right? You just say it's
No. There is no conversation about security. The conversation is, hey, HR team, do you want to never talk to IT again when you have to onboard or offboard a person from the organization? And by the way, you talk about churn based on organization size. Like, organizations just churn a certain percent, like monthly. Like, it's just a normal thing. Like, you get to 1,000 employees, like, you've just got people coming and going all the time, right? And now if you say, hey, CRO, like, you can hire salespeople without talking to us, they're like, oh shoot, man, we want that, right? I'm not saying like to be like totally subversive about it, because everybody gets what they want. Everybody else gets the ability to not talk to IT to do something. And IT, guess what? You're going to get a strong identity platform out of this exchange with some version of SAML, some version of SSO, and maybe, like, not YubiKey or Titan Key or whatever, but you'll probably end up with a good MFA platform in the process as well.
I don't know if you've seen that commercial, or it's not a commercial, but it's like, I think it's a TikTok or something, where like a person's feeding a blind dog, right? And they hold steak in front of its face, right? And they're like, dog's like, oh yeah, and then it puts broccoli in its mouth, right? And after about 3 or 4 attempts, the dog's like, wait a minute, this isn't freaking steak, right? And so, to your point, weaving in those things is like weaving in your vegetables right into your meal, but your vegetables still taste like steak because you get what you want, right? So that solid approach.
There's endless amounts of these things. Like, I'm not a like a RTO, work from home. Like, I that's such an organizationally specific thing, and like, I've got opinions on companies that are forcing RTOs of like what the underlying purpose is, aka quiet layoffs. But again, you've got an organizational desire to be like, oh, is Max actually working when he's at home? Like, the Wall Street Journal is finally talking about mouse jigglers. Like
you can strike this part, Max, okay? There's a freaking mouse jiggler right there, buddy. Like, security professionals use this stuff all the time. I think I have 3 of them in my room, right?
Oh man, I'm going to laugh about this for the rest of the day, but I mean, but that's the thing. I mean, I think this is where, I don't know, I'm going to come back to this because we've talked about this a few times right now where it's like, there's so much opportunity within security, within IT and security to get, like, it's funny, security, you want a better security posture for the organization to make the organization more secure. And like this, you kind of have to like, it's like, can you like Frogger it a little bit across the road in order to get where you need to get,
So it's almost like that guy with the fishing pole and the dollar. Huh? You got to be faster than that. You got to be faster than that.
I was thinking if there was anything else I wanted to cover and talk on, just as an aside, without saying names, companies, if you're ever going to a tech conference and you have a booth at the tech conference, please learn the lesson that companies are having to relearn and think about what your marketing team is putting in the booth. I'm just going to stop it there. I'm not going to say anything more. I'm just going to say, please just consider
In the booth, at after hours events,
just the whole thing, just, because
at the dance squads in the street.
just know it's not a good idea at this point in life. Like, just please, 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 please.
Yeah, agreed.
AJ, thank you very much for the time. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Max. It was great. Talk soon.
Talk to you. Bye.